Prepare to be illuminated.
In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the cards for the Imperial Army in Horus Heresy Legions. Now we're going to start by taking a look at the Warlords and then the various units and tactics available as part of the Imperial deck. The Imperial deck is the first of the neutral decks that we're looking at, which means that the cards from these decks can be used with any Warlord, any neutral Warlord that means, or even any Space Marine Warlords. So typically when you face Space Marines, you're going to face many of these cards as well, and similarly when you're building a Space Marine Warlord deck, you will want to include some of the cards from the Imperial Army deck as well. In addition, you may want some cards from the Chaos deck and the Adeptus Mechanicus deck, even if you play a Loyalist Warlord, and similarly Chaos Legion Warlords can include Imperial Army cards. Now we're going to start with the two Warlords, Colonel Ornatov and Liara Sarin. So before I even begin with that, one thing is that these two Warlords, they're pretty good as you make your way up the ladder, but they're not good at the top end of the ladder. And many players have asked the developers if they can change that to balance it, but the developers' response has always been that by design, the Space Marine decks are supposed to be stronger than the neutral decks. So at least for the time being, you're not going to see many of the Imperial Army Warlords towards the top of the ladder. Now next week we're going to see the release of some additional new cards for the Imperial Army faction as well as for Chaos and Mechanicus, and maybe some of those will help to balance them out and make them more usable at the top end. But until then, the Imperial Army Warlords are units you use to go up the ladder but not stay at the top or reach the very top. Alright, enough of that, let's get into this. So let's start with Colonel Ornatov. So his stats are towards the lower end, mostly it's in that health, 30 health. So all of the Warlords with 30 health start as a disadvantage compared to the 40 health Warlords because they can take a lot less damage, 25% less damage, and a lot of the times that health will make a difference. So what does Colonel Ornatov bring to compensate for that? Well, first of all, and this is a big one, he starts with 1 energy more, which means that whereas every other Warlord in the game is playing a unit or tactic of maximum energy cost 2 in the first turn, Ornatov starts with can play a more expensive, more powerful unit, and that advantage will last until the 8th turn for your enemy, when his available energy is going to go up to 10, which is the maximum in the game. The other really great ability Ornatov has is his Relentless ability, which means it triggers at the start of each turn. If he has no troops on the board, he adds a random Imperial Infantry to his hand. And this can be random. It might be the weakest, most common infantry unit that the Imperial deck has, or it might be the most powerful legendary unit that you have. Early on in the game, this makes a huge difference between him being able to play more powerful units at the start. When I mean early on the ladder, so as you're a newer player, facing Ornatov can be devastating because he starts with more energy, and when he doesn't have any troops, which includes his first turn, there's a possibility he's going to generate rare, epic, or legendary troops, which he'll be able to use to beat you down later in the match. His final ability, which partly compensates for his low health, is that for 1 energy he can give front line to a friendly troop, which means enemies have to attack that before anyone else. So Ornatov, as a result of all of this, can sometimes be found towards the top end, but it's rare, because especially later in the game, as things get more dangerous and more powerful units are out, he can make his own most powerful units soak up a lot of damage for him. The second Warlord is Liara Sarin. So Liara Sarin starts with, she has the same attack and health value, but her special ability is she starts with a card called the Ursus Claw in hand. We're going to take a look at that later on, but it's a 4 energy card which stuns all enemies on the field, which means it buys you a little bit of time. Also, she can put in play for 2 energy a unit with 2 attack and 3 health called an Armsman, who has the front line ability so they can soak up damage, and who also has flanks so they can attack immediately, which makes them pretty flexible. Unfortunately, their stats are not that great, so although this ability is pretty handy at the beginning of a match, later on you're going to find those poor Armsmen are getting really outmatched by what they have to face. So as a result, again, Lotara is great in the lower rungs of the ladder, but she struggles at the higher end. And in fact, you see very few Lotara Sirens once you reach Terra. Again, with the new neutral cards coming out in 1 week's time, so on January 17th, 2018, it's possible Lotara will become more competitive. But until then, let's just get into the units. So the Imperial Army is one of the factions which has a free zero-cost card. In this case, it's Unsettled Populace, has 1 attack, 1 health. This card is it's not really worth using a spot in your deck because you can only have 30 cards. These weak guys are not going to do much for you, so your space is better used on anyone else. Of course, if you're lacking other cards, then you could include them, but honestly, apart from niche builds for Emperor's Children and Death Guard and Iron Hands, low-cost cheap units like this are not terribly useful. Next up is Burning Tower. This is an interesting tactic. Both players lose 1 maximum energy. This doesn't get used that often because it hurts you as well as hurting the enemy. The one exception is Colonel Ornatov. Especially if he gets this card in his first turn, he can pretty much shut down the enemy and buy himself a turn to play an extra unit, because Ornatov already starts with 3 energy, so you can play a unit of cost 2 and play Burning Tower, and that means on your enemy's first turn, instead of having 2 energy, which is what you need for most Warlord special abilities or most of the cheap troops people start to include in their decks, the enemy will only have 1 energy and they can't do anything. Outside of Ornatov, you rarely get this getting used, so we're going to pass over this one. Next is Health Irregulars. These guys have a similar issue to Unsettled Populace, especially with only 1 health. They aren't terribly useful unless you're trying to put out a bunch of cheap units for a specific tactic. So again, not terribly great. I would pass over them. Alright, next up, Facade Een Infantry. So these guys are starting to get more interesting. Although on the surface of things they have the same problem, that they only have 1 attack and 1 health, and they cost 1 energy, they redeem themselves a little bit with their Backlash ability. When they die, you can draw a card. So these guys can be useful because they help to make sure that you're working your way through your deck and getting to the cards which you really want in order to win your match. So these guys are worth including as a cheap unit because there are going to be a lot of times when you only have 1 energy left. It's hard to use an ability or play units from your hand. Having these guys available is a good way of using that remaining energy and helping yourself when they die by drawing a card. Alright, the next cheap unit, Farrens Militia. Now these guys are also very interesting. They only cost 1 energy, they only have 1 health, they've got 2 attacks, that's kind of useful. But if they survive till your next turn, you can put in play a copy of them automatically. And that copy as well can benefit from the same ability, and so they can spawn and multiply. So these guys can be great if you have a way of keeping them alive, like units with front line or the ability to give them survivor. Most of the time when you play them though, the most valuable thing they're going to do for you is your enemy is going to try to waste energy or waste a unit's attack trying to take these guys out before they multiply. So they can be great for that. The big watch out is do not play these guys if you are facing Corax. If you are facing Corax, he's just going to harvest them. He's going to wait till you get 2 of them and then keep killing 1 of them each turn to stay invisible with his Corax. So you definitely do not want to be using these guys if Corax is on field. If you have it in your hand, keep it there. Alright, next up is another tactic, Letishailluminatus. This tactic is used in many decks across Warlords. Again, as I mentioned, it's really important to go hunting through your deck to find the cards which you need, and Letishailluminatus is a good way of doing that. On the downside is that your opponent will also hunt through his deck a little bit, but it's not so bad. There's some niche builds where you either inflict damage or when you draw cards, or make your enemy take damage when they draw cards, and Letishailluminatus can also combo well with those. That tends to be Alpha Legion who can do that. So this is a good card. You'll see this included in many top level decks. Farrens II Auxilary. These guys are not bad. Their stats themselves are terrible, but they're cheap, and adjacent troops, although not your warlord, will gain +1 permanently on their attacks when these guys go in play. So they can be handy. The one downside is that they're practically useless if you don't have other troops in play at this time. But they can have a place in decks. Alright, next up is Ricochet. I like this card. I tend to use it with warlords who have the ability to do 2 damage to targets, because there are a lot of units in the game with 3 health, and Ricochet helps you to inflict finishers on them. So I like this card. There are a couple of decks where I'll use this, especially in the Captured Mandragorax deck, which is the Chaos Titan. This card is brilliant there. Winter Squad. This is useless. It is very cheap, but it dies really easily in one turn to just about anything. It's kind of a waste of time. You see very few people deliberately including Winter Squad in their deck. Again, the exception is if you have a deck where you need cheap units to come out or units to die in order to trigger a special ability. So Winter Squad in general gets a thumbs down. Abandoned Supplies. This one is a favorite of top level players. You'll find it in many of the best decks. I keep talking about hunting through your deck to find your cards. Abandoned Supplies helps you to do that, and especially if you're trying to bring an expensive card into your hand for later on. By reducing its cost by 2, Abandoned Supplies allows you to play your powerful abilities earlier in the match. This card is great. It's a definite inclusion in almost any deck. Ghazals Defenders is practically useless. It costs a lot of energy. It has great health, 4, but it's got really terrible attack. The only deck where you might possibly want to include this is a Colonel Ornatov deck, where you perhaps want to use his special ability to give this front line, but there are better ways of spending the 3 energy there. So that'll be 2 energy to play these guys and 1 energy for Ornatov's ability, because these guys are not going to do much to people who are attacking them. So these are rare to use. Grops Riders, again, now they're a frontline ability, fantastic attack, poor health, so sort of the inverse of the previous guys. You're going to see a lot of these in the game, but they're usually getting generated by an ability, mostly Ornatov's Barge. Very few people deliberately include Grops Riders because as a defensive unit, they've got front line, they die too easily. So the first thing to attack them will kill them always. So don't put this card in your deck. Next up is Nisr Scouts. These guys are good. They're very popular because they've got stealth, so when they get deployed, they're not going to get killed immediately. They've got sneak attacks, so they don't take any damage while they're attacking. And although their their attack value is low, it's only 1. There's a lot of cards, like we just saw the Frisian Auxiliaries earlier on, who cost 1 energy. There are various other cards which will allow you to increase the attack value on units, and Nisr Scouts combos excellently with that. They've got enough health that they can take at least 1 hit from many units and abilities in the game, and with that stealth attack ability, with that sneak attack ability, if you can find a way to increase their attack value through a tactic or through other units, they become really great. These guys are an absolute favorite of Farrens Militia for the Iron Hands Primarch, because he gives units bonus attacks, as well as of Fabius Bile of the Emperor's Children, who always will include these guys in his deck because he can boost their attack every turn. Alright, Sabotage. This is a tactic which I love. There are so many Space Marine cards, especially, but so many other cards with fantastic special abilities. And Sabotage is a really cheap way of just cancelling those abilities out. So I like this card. It's definitely worth thinking about including in your deck. Siren 12th Regiment. This is an interesting one, especially for a lot of new players. They love to include these guys because they're pretty cheap. They've got 2 attack, they've got 3 health, so they can take a fair number of hits. And it's an okay card. It's just that they're also, especially for Astartes Legions, there's some better defensive cards and abilities you get. It's worth including Siren 12th until you can figure out something better to replace them with. There I use these guys a lot, and only recently my decks have started to not really include them so much. Underground Fort. If your deck has a lot of Imperial Army units, this is definitely worth putting in there. Once you put it down, your enemy will try to kill it as quickly as possible, but it's allows you to quickly put out a bunch of cards and try to take board control before your enemy can react. Especially if you get this in turn 1, it's pretty hard for most Warlords to kill something with 3 health in the first turn, and so it'll give you a big leg up in the battle to come if you get this guy down early on and keep him alive. Yeah, so just to recap, it decreases the cost of any other Imperial troops by 1. Alright. Next up is Slovak 12th Infantry. Unless your deck has a lot of Imperial Army units, this is not worth putting in because his special ability, although fantastic, it only affects other Imperial cards. So if you have lots of Imperial cards, definitely use this guy, otherwise forget him. Barnard Sappers, they can be extremely powerful, but it's too situational. They cost 3 energy, they only have 2 health, so they can get killed by a lot of abilities and splash damage in the game. So when they work incredibly well, but a lot of the times you're never going to get a chance to use them, because if your enemy is planning on playing a structure or a vehicle and you put these guys down, he'll usually delay until he has a way of killing these guys. So I would say no to them unless you really feel that vehicles and structures are giving you problems and frustrating you and you really need something for them. Next up, Bunker. This is pretty average. It's 3 energy, lots of health. It does 1 damage to anyone hitting it, but usually it can last a couple of turns. It's pretty popular. It's an okay card. I don't like it that much because of the fact it only does 1 damage to people. But this is very, very popular early on in the ladder, and you'll still see it popping up a fair bit on Terra with some decks. So yeah, this is a nice card, I guess. Calth Infantry. These guys are 2 for 1. When you play these guys for 3 energy, you also get a second guy being dropped next to them, who's a 2 attack 1 health Calth Irregular. I overall rate this as slightly below average. It's worth including if you don't have anything else, but the problem is these guys all have low health. 2 health on these guys, 1 health on the Calth Irregular. Again, there's too many area damage abilities that can kill them quickly, but maybe you want to try to tempt the enemy to use his area damage quickly to get rid of them. So I personally don't tend to do a lot of that. These are a critical part of Farrens Militia deck builds, because the Iron Hands Primarch really wants to see his friendly units getting killed to trigger his Reckoning. And yeah, so it's sometimes worth it. I just don't like them. Okay, now these next 2 cards are brilliant. Goldstone's Hunters. This is quite possibly the best troop card in the whole game. If you don't have this card and you ever see it in the store, you must buy it. Almost every single top deck in the game contains 2 Goldstone's Hunters. Why? They're cheap, they only cost 3 energy, so you can always play them in the second turn of the game. They have fantastic stats, 3 attack and 3 health, meaning they can hit a Warlord and survive and do quite a bit of damage. They've got fast, so they can attack straight away on the turn you deploy them, and they've got unstoppable, so no matter how many defensive frontline units the enemy Warlord has, Goldstone Hunters can hit him. If the enemy has a tough unit deploy you want to get rid of, well, Goldstone's Hunters is an immediate 3 damage on that unit. So you can use them in so many different ways. They're fantastic. They're actually one of the few Imperial Army cards which are significantly better than any of the Space Marine equivalents. This is my vote for the best card in the game right now. One of the next top cards in the game is Jewback Starsight. So this is the Imperial Army legendary guy. Well, he's one of the legendary cards. Again, he's cheap. His stats are okay, 2 attack and a whopping 4 health, but his ability is what people are after. So having cards to play is critical in this game. If you ever run out of cards in your hand, you're on your way to losing. Jewback will start copying the enemy's cards, and a lot of the times you're going to copy the enemy's best cards. I don't know if it's random or what, if there's any weighting, but a lot of people swear they see their best cards being grabbed by Jewback. I know rationally it shouldn't be true, but emotionally it feels that way. And the best one is when you have Jewback and you copy someone else's Jewback and you play that one, and both your Jewbacks copy his Jewback again. Then you got 4 Jewbacks, and you're never going to run out of cards. More tactically though, when you play Jewback, you could use him in one of 2 ways. Either save him for a late game when you've got the ability to try to defend him, like with units with front line, and hope he survives for multiple turns while feeding you cards, or just play him as soon as you can, because that'll buy you time, because with his 4 health, the enemy is either going to have to use a couple of units to hit him and beat him down early on, or you waste one of his powerful abilities trying to get rid of Jewback in one go. So it's a card which buys you time at the very least and gives you 1 card always. Definitely worth having. Almost every deck will include Jewback unless you really don't want cards from the enemy. Next up, Crack Grenade. This is pretty good. It'll be used in your deck a lot until you reach Terra and you've got more powerful units. And even on Terra, it can be extremely useful. Crack Grenades deals 5 damage to a vehicle troop, which will wreck at least half the vehicles in the game, and vehicles can be very powerful. Or they can even do 2 damage to anyone else. So I use these guys to finish off enemy warlords a lot. I'll keep it in my hand in case they play a vehicle. If a vehicle doesn't pop out onto the board, I use this as part of my finishing combo on the enemy. So yes, include this. Salen 11th Infantry. These guys are below average. 3 energy, 3 health, but their attack value is low. It gets compensated a little bit by their backlash. When they die, you can draw a card, but I don't think they're really worth it most of the time. So I don't tend to use these guys. Training Cage can be a great tactic if you use it at the right time. Giving +1 to the troops in your hand can give you a huge advantage, but the disadvantage is you're losing out on the ability to spend 3 energy. So your enemy might drop a unit which is going to pummel you for a while, but in return you're boosting the units which you have in your hand, and so you'll get your revenge over time. I use this a lot in the events, not so much out of choice. It's there in the event decks I get dealt, and I find it useful, but having said that, I don't tend to use it in ladder myself. I would rather get an extra unit out usually and have it be more powerful than put no unit now and have more powerful units later. It's a personal choice. I've seen people wreck me when they've got Training Cage in their hands, so it can go either way. Valis' Brigade, it's another frontline unit at 3 energy cost. This gets used quite rarely because with only 2 health, they get killed too easily by special abilities, so don't include these. Again, you're going to see these guys come up a lot with Ornithop's Barge, but in general, they're not popular. Boris' Trackers. Now, these guys are getting much better. You're going to see these, again, especially in Imperial Guard decks, but also in some neutral decks, because they can be a really good defensive unit. Especially when the enemy has lots of cheap guys out, these will actually flip the situation in your favor, because with that 3 attack, they can kill many units which will attack them, or at least hurt them very badly. So this is a good card, and they get stronger the more enemies that there are. Compliance. I was really excited when this card came out in the Isvan expansion, but this is... maybe it's because I didn't play enough Imperial cards. I just find that I don't get a good time to spend 4 energy to make the rest of my cards cheaper. Already, if anything, I struggle with running out of cards, so I don't want to make mine cheaper and then be out of cards sooner, so I don't know. This should be an exciting ability, I just couldn't find a good way to use it. Crumbling Battleground... It's okay. I don't include it in my decks anymore. I just found it seems to do as much harm as benefit. So, if your enemy if your enemy is using lots of weak units, this can make a difference. But otherwise, yeah, you see very few of these. Alright, Felicia and 5th Airborne. These guys are good. You'll see these quite a lot. They have low health, but they have stealth. So on the turn they get deployed, they've got a pretty good chance of surviving. There are relatively few area damage abilities, which can do 3 damage at once. And then they can counter with, if they survive the turn, they do a whopping 5 damage to your enemy. And assuming they survive doing that, then they're a top priority for him to kill, so they end up defending you. Because while he's trying to kill these guys, he's not killing you. Markos Rangers. This is a pretty solid unit. You don't see too many of these just because it's too conditional. If you start a turn where the enemy has no units at all, you're spending 4 energy to just put a unit down with 2 attack. Yes, it has 4 health, but it only have just 3 attack because the warlord always counts as an enemy. But they can sometimes come out as a little bit weak for their energy cost. And if the enemy has a lot of units, I mean, fine, they'll get buffed really high, but with only 4 health, they get focused down and taken out quickly. Most Space Marine decks have more powerful infantry than this for 4 energy, so you rarely only see these guys in Imperial Army decks. McCormick Reapers. These guys are popular. They cost 4 energy, they always have 4 attack and 4 health, but the best thing is, if the enemy kills them in their turn, the card comes back to your hand. So you have the ability to play them again and and it lowers the chances of you running out of cards. I like these guys. They're a good card to use in any deck, Imperial or Space Marine. Mortar Strike, very popular, very powerful. Yes, include it in your deck. It sounds bad, like deal 5 damage to a random enemy, but what about when there's no enemy units, it's just the warlord? This allows you to really pick on and punish the enemy warlord and hit him hard. And a lot of the times your enemy will deploy a powerful unit. Maybe it's just their warlord and their powerful unit. And a Mortar Strike will give you a win-win either way. Either you hit their warlord hard or you hit their powerful unit hard and can hopefully kill it with something else. So yes, include Mortar Strike. Rifler Squad, this one is quite rare to see. I personally love these guys. Their attack value sucks, but for 3 energy they can deal 4 damage, which will kill or set up to be killed many of the units you'll face. So I like these guys. They're especially great if your deck's quite defensive and has the ability to heal them or protect them. So I use this in my Iron Hands deck with my Forex Warlord, who creates barricades, and then these guys essentially hide behind the barricades and rain damage down. Smirnoff Warriors, these guys are very popular. Their stats alone are fine, but again, now if you play them when the enemy has multiple units, you're going to copy back in your hands. Again, this touches on the issue of not running out of cards, and their stats are pretty solid for 4 energy. This is a good card. Aratan. This one is not that popular. In theory it's great, but it can be very situational as well. Like if the enemy only has a single unit and it's super powerful, yes, you're stunning it for 5 energy, but you're only doing 3 damage to it. On the other hand, maybe your enemy has lots of cheap units out there and all of a sudden you're doing 12 damage to a unit with very little health. So it's too sensitive to the situation, so you rarely see top players using Aratan. Duke Mordecai, on the other hand, is a top dog. He is great. In theory, he's great for his ability, for his stats, which are fantastic for 5 energy, and his ability looks incredible as well. Realistically though, most of the time you play Duke Mordecai, you're not going to get his ability. His real value is he's a 5 energy top level meat shield. Your enemy is going to go and do whatever it takes to get rid of Duke Mordecai before your next turn starts, because Duke Mordecai can be devastating through that ability to return a troop to hand. So definitely include him. Don't be disappointed if you don't get to use his ability. Just be happy when the enemy wastes some of their best abilities or best units trying to kill Duke Mordecai. Firewalkers is a fantastic card as well. This is a vehicle just like the earlier unit. It's a vehicle which goes down with stealth, but when you play it on the board for that turn, adjacent units, which include your warlord, gain +1 attack, and that makes adjacent units suddenly much more powerful. In fact, because they cost 5 energy and Felicia 5th Airborne costs 4 energy, this is a fantastic combo. On your 3rd turn, you play Felicia 5th Airborne. They survive until your 4th turn because of stealth, and then you play Firewalkers between those Felicia 5th Airborne and your warlord. All of a sudden, your warlord has 3 attack, and Felicia 5th Airborne has 6 attack. So that's 9 damage you're doing that turn because of these guys, which is great. Hanan's Mortars is also pretty good. It also damages a random enemy. It does 4 damage. The one downside is their cost for their stats. So I'll use these guys in many decks. Typically I'll use it if I've managed to kill the enemy troops. It's just their warlord left and I have 5 energy. Then I'll play these guys and punish them with another 4 damage. And then typically they'll last another 1 or 2 turns afterwards. It lets them deal another 2 to 4 damage points before they die. So that's not bad. 9 damage, 4 to 9 damage between 4 to 8 damage for 5 energy. Manifest Destiny. You will see this in a lot of top decks, especially aggressive decks where the warlord is expected to attack a lot. Angron decks will include this card a lot, as will many Vulcan decks. It's great. It basically has 5 extra health points to your warlord, but 5 really good health points because your warlord has to be killed first, and excess damage from the killing blow does not carry over to Manifest Destiny's survivor health. So it makes your warlord really tanky. It is a good card, worth having. Missile Battery. This one sucks. I used to think it should be great, but it costs a lot. It cannot attack on its own. It can only affect enemy troops, and its special ability costs a ton of energy. So it's not worth it at all. So let's pass on that. Static fighters are okay. For 5 energy, most Space Marine decks have better units, but for an Imperial Army deck or other neutral deck, if you really want a hard-hitting unit at 5 energy, go ahead and take this. These guys work incredibly well for Colonel Ornatov because he can play them for 5 energy, use 1 energy to give them front line, and if these guys survive till their next turn, well, you don't want to attack or do anything with them because they're your front line, but for 1 energy you can make another copy of them and then put that into play as well and then give that front line too. So these guys are great for Ornatov and not so great for Space Marines. Pretty much the same thing goes for Assad Chimera. So stats wise it's okay. Its ability is quite handy, especially if you find yourself running out of units in games. So yeah, this was just pretty average. Again, Space Marine decks will have better units at 6 energy, but this will really tend to only show up in neutral decks. Forced Ogrins. These guys you'll see a lot at all levels, including many top decks. These are one of the most this is one of the most common strong defensive units. 6 energy cost, but it has 6 health, so it can take a real beating. It has 5 damage, so whoever beats it is going to get beat hard in return, and it has front line. These guys are great. Helios Mortar Carrier. This one is also great. Again, its stats are nothing to write home about, but it's a special ability over here. At the end of your turn, deal 3 damage to a random enemy. This can mess up somebody's day, especially if you ever get 2 of these guys out at once. They're going to be pounding the enemy hard and you're setting them up to lose the match. This is found in many decks, so yeah, fantastic card. Merit's Mercenaries as well. This can be very strong. When I later talk about the Mechanicus deck, one of the Mechanicus warlords, Kelbar Hal, makes gigantic use of these guys. For 6 energy, their stats are slightly below average, but assuming they survive till the next turn, they become lethal because every time you play a card, they gain +1 on their attack and +1 to their health. And so especially if you have lots of cheap cards in your hand or an ability to create cheap cards, these guys can get very powerful very quickly. In the right hands with a Mechanicus deck, it's normal to see these guys with double-digit attack and health values and absolutely wrecking. Ornatov's Barge. This will get used all the way into the very best decks in the game. This is fantastic. It's a Hail Mary card basically. What do you do when the enemy has lots of units, he's swamping all over you? You play Ornatov's Barge and you buy yourself a ton of front line by throwing out a whole bunch of random Imperial troops who have front line. If you're unlucky, it's a whole bunch of Winter Squads with 1 attack and 2 health. If you're lucky, it's a whole bunch of Ogrins with 5 attack and 6 health. You don't know what you're getting, but what you're always getting is time in some way, shape, or form. Command Post as well. So this card gets used most often in Imperial decks, because again, at 7 energy, many Space Marine decks have better cards, but it's not bad overall. It has strong health value, so it's going to survive usually. It's got a pretty good attack value, so it's going to hurt whoever attacks it hard, and its special ability is incredible. It gives +2 attack and health to another friendly troop as well as front line. So it can make a strong unit incredibly strong, and it can make a weak unit into a problem. So this card is not bad. Its biggest drawback is it goes into play very late in the game. Of course, if you use abandoned supplies and you manage to pull this up, all of a sudden this card comes up in your 5 energy turn, and it can become a game changer at that point. Alrighty, coming up to the end now. Melt-A-Bomb. This is a tactic. It's pretty okay. It's worth including early on, but later on, as you get better 7 energy cards, it's going to drop out. It is an instant destruction of a vehicle or structure, and coming up at the 7 energy turn, usually you'll get this card in your hand around the time when your opponent is going to be playing some very powerful vehicles. So it destroys a vehicle immediately and damages the adjacent units, often including the enemy warlord. So I used to use this card a lot until my rating reached close to around 2,000, 2,500, and then I got better cards and I dropped this one out. Ogryn Sergeant can be really good. These guys get stronger the more often your warlord is damaged. So yeah, if you have it, it's a good card to have. Again, Space Marines, well, you know, I mean, this is a pretty top tier card. It can go up against most cards with cost 7 and trade relatively favorably, especially once your warlord starts taking a bit of damage. This is a good card to have. Lernia Hydra. This one can be good. It's got great stats. It's just that it's most other vehicles at this cost have great stats and a really great ability. This one has an okay ability. So it slows down the enemy if they're planning on using tactics. If they're not planning on using tactics, this does not do that much for you. So I rarely use this in most decks so far, but it's not a bad one. If you're missing high cost cards and you need something for a bit of punch late game, this one will do the job. Shipmaster Carrier. He's a pretty strong legendary card. Nothing wrong with him. Most Space Marine legendaries are slightly better, but in game there's a lot of high energy legendary costs which are tactics, which tend to get favored instead, because the problem with a troop is often he's going to get killed before he gets to act, especially with how powerful his ability is. When you play this guy, he will be priority number 1, just like Duke Mortimer, for the enemy to take out. If he survives for a turn though, he can really mess up the other guy's plans, because for only 1 energy he can push the enemy's most strong unit back to their hand. So it's a good card to use if you have it. Zerial Storm. This looks fantastic except for its abilities. So first of all, it cannot attack. So that 7 attack value it has, you don't get to benefit from that. The only way it inflicts that 7 attack is if the enemy chooses to attack it. And the second issue is its relentless ability, 10 damage to a random enemy, which means it might do 10 damage and kill the enemy warlord, or it might try to do 10 damage to that really cheap unit the enemy deployed at the end of his turn. Because of that unreliability, you tend to not see Zerial Storm that often in top decks. So again, if you don't have a better unit, include it, but think twice about it. Same thing applies to Hell's Fury. It does 10 damage to a random enemy. Arguably this is slightly better, although you have to pay an energy cost, because you get to choose when to do this 10 damage. See, if the enemy put out a weak unit to try to confuse your random attack, you can kill the weak unit and then use this attack. So I personally think this is slightly better than Zerial Storm, but it's a toss-up between the two. I personally don't use either of them, never have in my decks. Triumph of Olanor can be very situational. I've used this occasionally and it's been a game winner, but the problem is you really need to have this card in your hand for a long time, and otherwise it's just taking up space in your deck. What's worst of all is when you're almost done with a game, and then your Triumph of Eleanor comes into your hand, and you know that you're never really going to get a proper chance to use this. So this one can be great, but it's too unreliable, and I don't like to include it. Alright, those are all the regular cards, just a couple of remaining cards. So Barricade shows up in the Imperial Army deck, but it's actually generated only by an Iron Warriors Warlord, so we're going to ignore this card. Armsman is Lotara Saren's special ability, so for 2 energy she gets to create one of these guys. Their stats are okay, and these guys are fantastic in the early game, but by late game they just struggle to compete, so they're not that great. They get too easily blocked by high health frontline units, so Lotara struggles at the high end of the ladder in late games. These guys don't cut it. And lastly, Lotara's Ursa's Claw. So as I mentioned, it stuns all enemies on the board, and you can then draw cards. It buys you some time. So normally the idea is you would use this if the enemy has some powerful units. You play down something to start killing it with next turn, and then you play Ursa's Claw to stun the enemy unit, and then hopefully still finish it off the following turn. Alright, so I hope you guys found this useful. In my next video, I'm going to be going and doing the same run through for the Chaos deck, and after that we're going to do the Mechanicus deck. Once I've covered all 3 neutral decks, we're going to start getting into how you build a deck. We'll start with Sons of Horus and use Gavriel Loken as an example. And yep, so you can learn about what factors you should consider as you're putting together a deck, and you'll see an example of the thought process which we'll follow. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you're going to find the upcoming videos useful. Please subscribe, and you'll get notified as they get posted. Alright, so hope you keep having fun playing Horus Heresy Legions. Bye guys.